1 year ago, Magnus Carlsen slammed the table. Millions watched the greatest chess player of all time break after a devastating blunder. Today, he came for revenge. Norway Chess 2026. Magnus has the black pieces against the reigning world champion Gukesh. The game begins. White pushes the queen's pawn to d4. Black matches queen's pawn to d5. White strikes with the c-pawn to c4, initiating the deadly queen's gambit. Black declines, pushing the e-pawn to e6. White's knight develops to c3. Black's knight jumps to f6. White's c-pawn captures on d5. Black's e-pawn recaptures, opening the center. White's bishop slides to g5, pinning the knight to the queen, but Magnus goes completely off the grid. His bishop leaps to b4. White develops his knight to f3, and Magnus swings his queen out to d6, a wild, aggressive Ragozin defense. White reroutes his knight to d2. Black builds an indestructible wall, c-pawn to c6. White's queen steps to c2. Black pushes his h-pawn to h6, questioning the bishop. Gukesh Lunges, knight to b5, 3 threats at once. Black's queen calmly sidesteps to e7. White's bishop captures the knight on f6. Black's g-pawn is forced to recapture. Look at Magnus's kingside, it is completely shattered. Most players would panic. Magnus Carlsen smiles. That open g-file is no longer a weakness. It is a weapon. White's knight retreats to c3. Black's knight maneuvers to d7. White solidifies e-pawn to e3. Black's knight hops to b6. White's bishop takes the d3 diagonal, and here begins the legendary kingside attack. Magnus slides his rook to g8, staring down the open file. White pushes the g-pawn to g3. Black's bishop sneaks into h3. This is brilliant positional chess. That bishop permanently traps White's king in the center. Gukesh can never castle. White attacks with the a-pawn to a3. Black's bishop chops the knight on c3. White's b-pawn recaptures, permanently ruining White's pawn structure. Black's knight retreats to c8. White tries to blow up the center, c-pawn to c4. Black's d-pawn captures on c4. White's queen recaptures. Black's knight jumps to its perfect square on d6, attacking the queen. White's queen runs to b4. Black pushes the a-pawn to a5, squeezing space. White's queen flees to c3. Magnus lifts his rook to g5. The heavy artillery has arrived. White's bishop retreats to e2. Black's other rook joins the fight on c8. Perfect piece coordination. White plays the f-pawn to f3, desperate to hold, but Magnus explodes the center, c-pawn to c5. White's king runs for his life to f2. Black's rook centralizes to d5. White's queen steps to b2. Black's c-pawn captures on d4. White's e-pawn recaptures. Black tucks his king safely into the shadows on f8. White brings the rook to e1. Black's bishop drops to e6. White's rook challenges on d1. Black's f-pawn marches to f5. White's knight retreats to f1. And then, the move of the tournament, Black's f-pawn explodes to f4. A crushing pawn sacrifice, creating 4 simultaneous threats. White's bishop moves to d3. Black's queen locks onto f6. White's bishop anchors on e4. Black's rook seizes the b5 square. White's queen steps to d2. Black's bishop lands on b3, sealing the coffin. White contests the open file, rook to c1. Black instantly trades, rook captures on c1. White's queen recaptures. And the killing blow arrives. Black's queen crashes to d4. Check. White's king flees to g2. Black's bishop drops to e6. White's queen desperately captures the f4 pawn, but Magnus obliterates the second rank. Rook to b2. Check. White's king is forced into the corner on h1. Black's queen lunges to f2. Checkmate on g2 is completely unstoppable. The final dying kicks. White's queen checks on d6. Black's king steps to g7. White's queen checks on e5. Black's f-pawn blocks on f6. White's queen is forced to sacrifice itself, capturing the rook on b2. Black's queen captures on b2. White's rook goes to b1. Black's queen effortlessly captures the a3 pawn. White's rook throws one last check on b7. Black's king walks to f8. White pushes the g-pawn to g4 in total desperation. Magnus casually rolls his passed a-pawn to a4. Unstoppable pawn, an inescapable fate. Gukesh looks at the board and resigns. The ghost of 2025 has been destroyed. Magnus Carlsen just proved to the entire world he is still the final boss of chess.